I learned I was a replacement from a piece of paper that did not care whether I was alive. The notice board stood at the far end of the transit hall, bolted into a cracked ferrocrete wall between two malfunctioning lumen strips. One flickered constantly, the other buzzed with a tired electrical whine, bathing the board in a sickly yellow light. The air around it smelled of adhesive paste, damp ash, and the faint sweetness of decay that never quite left Imperial facilities built too close to war zones. Bodies had passed through this hall for months, some walking, some carried, and the smell had soaked into the walls. The board was already crowded. Sheets of parchment overlapped one another, corners curling from moisture, ink bleeding where rain or sweat or blood had touched them. Some were torn down partially, leaving ragged edges and names cut in half. Others were layered so thickly that the board bowed outward, as if straining under the weight of its own information. I recognized none of the names at first. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. A clerk stood on a small step ladder, pinning up a fresh notice. He wore the grey-brown robes of the administratum, stained darker at the cuffs and hem, his fingers permanently blackened by ink. He did not look at the people gathered behind him. He did not need to. His task was the board, not us. When he pressed the pin through the paper, he did it with practiced force, driving it in until the metal squealed faintly against the board's backing. When he stepped down, I saw my name, or what passed for my name now. It had been written carefully, the letters neat and evenly spaced, followed by a designation code and an arrow pointing to a unit reference I did not recognize. The ink was still wet enough to shine under the lumen light. For a moment, my mind refused to connect the letters to myself. I felt as though I were reading about someone else entirely, someone unlucky but distant. Replacements, the clerk said without turning around. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, already moving on to the next task in his mind. Report to quartering within the hour. Papers in hand. This is an honor. The Imperium still has use for you. Honor. The word hung in the air like incense gone stale. No one spoke. Around me, men and women leaned forward slightly, scanning the board with hollow eyes. Some exhaled when they did not find their names. Others stiffened when they did. I watched a man 2 places down from me trace the letters of his designation with a shaking finger, as if checking they were real. He swallowed hard and stepped back, his face pale and drawn. No one congratulated him. I moved closer to the board, my boots scraping against the gritty floor. Up close, the parchment smelled stronger, glue ash, and something else underneath. Old smoke, perhaps. Or burned cloth. The lower notices were older, their ink faded to brown. I noticed some had been crossed out with thick black lines, the names obliterated so completely that nothing remained but dark scars on paper. Others had been stamped with a single word, Decisidi. The stamp ink was thick and uneven, as if applied in haste. That was when it became clear. These were not announcements of reinforcement. They were corrections. Each notice was not a call to join, but a patch applied where something had torn. Someone had been there before me, standing in a trench, manning a gun, carrying a slate, and they had failed to continue. The system had noted the absence and filled it with a new entry. Me. I felt a strange, delayed chill spread through my chest. Not fear, exactly. More like the sensation of realizing you have already stepped off a ledge and only now notice the ground is gone. A second clerk moved through the crowd, checking papers with brisk efficiency. When he reached me, I handed mine over automatically. He compared the code on my documents to the notice, nodded once, and stamped the corner of the page with a sharp, practiced motion. The stamp hit hard enough to jolt my hand. Replacement status confirmed, he said. Do not be late. Lateness will be interpreted as refusal. I began, then stopped. There was no question I could ask that would not sound like resistance. Resistance was not something one survived. The clerk had already moved on. I stepped back from the board and let someone else take my place. The hall felt smaller now, the ceiling lower, the walls closer. Somewhere, a transport engine rumbled to life, its vibration thrumming through the floor and into my bones. I tried to steady my breathing, to think in practical terms. Replacement meant reassignment. Reassignment meant survival, at least for now. That was the logic I had been raised on. But another thought crept in. uninvited and persistent. If I was a replacement, then someone else had been erased, not ceremonially, not mourned, simply overwritten. I imagined the previous occupant of my designation. I could not see his face, but I could see the space he had left behind, a gap in a firing line, a blank line in a report, a sudden absence noticed only because it disrupted a schedule. His failure had been administrative before it was mortal. His death had mattered only because it required correction. That was the true horror of it. Not that men died. Death was expected. But that death was treated as an error to be fixed. The clerk on the ladder had already begun pinning another notice over an older one, covering a faded name completely. The pin punched through both sheets at once. I watched the motion with a detached fascination, realizing that this was how the Imperium remembered its dead, not with monuments or prayers, but with layers of paper. I thought of my own name, how easily it had fit into the space left behind. Around me the hall began to empty as people drifted away, each toward their assigned fate. Some walked quickly, eager to get the waiting over with. Others moved slowly, as if hoping delay might somehow change the outcome. I stood still for a moment longer, staring at the board until the clerk cleared his throat sharply. "Move along," he said. "The board is not for contemplation." I turned away then, my papers folded tightly in my hand. As I walked, I felt an odd sensation, like wearing clothes that still held another person's warmth. The designation printed on my documents no longer felt like an assignment. It felt like a debt. I understood, dimly but irrevocably, that I had not been chosen because I was capable. I had been chosen because I was available. Someone else had broken badly enough to be removed, and I was the next piece slotted into place to maintain the illusion of continuity. The Imperium did not reinforce. It substituted, and as I followed the signs toward quartering, the notice board behind me already disappearing into the haze of dust and exhaust, I realized that my life from this moment on would not be measured by what I achieved, but by how long I could prevent myself from becoming another name pinned to the dead. They processed me the way a manufacturer processes scrap, quickly, without sentiment, and with the assumption that whatever came in would be reshaped to fit whatever output quota had been set. Quartering sat in the belly of a half-ruined depot, a wide chamber whose walls still carried faded hazard sigils from when it stored fuel instead of people. The ceiling was low enough that the hanging chains brushed helmets when men passed beneath them. Lumen globes dangled in wire cages and cast a weak, greasy light that made everyone look sick. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil, wet canvas, and bodies that had not been properly washed in too long. Somewhere deeper in the depot, a generator clattered and coughed like an old man trying to keep breathing out of spite. A line formed in front of a long counter built from bolted-together crates. Behind it, a quartermaster and two scribes worked with the mechanical rhythm of people who had been doing this for so long that the act had replaced thought. Papers slid forward, stamps came down, equipment slid back, a servitor stood to one side, its augmetic arms stacked with folded uniforms, its flesh parts pale and slack, as if it had been drained of anything resembling purpose except obedience. When my turn came, the quartermaster did not greet me. He extended a hand, palm up, demanding papers like a tax collector. I placed my documents in his grip. He scanned the unit stamp, the replacement code, the designation I was now supposed to answer to. His eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with grease. His eyelashes had the faint glitter of metallic dust. He made a small sound, half a grunt, half a sigh, and pushed my papers to the nearest scribe, who immediately began transcribing my existence into a ledger. Continuity package, the quartermaster said, issued to replacement personnel. Sign here. A quill was thrust toward me. The ink pot beside it smelled sharp, chemical, slightly sweet. I signed where indicated, my hand shaking despite my efforts to keep it steady. The quartermaster stamped the parchment so hard the counter jolted. Next, he called, already reaching for the next set of papers. The servitor stepped forward and began placing items on the counter in front of me. First, a uniform. It was folded neatly, but it did not feel new. The fabric was stiff with dried sweat, the seams worn smooth by movement, the collar darker where someone's neck had rubbed it raw. When I lifted it, the smell rose immediately, salted human sweat, old smoke, and the faint iron tang of dried blood that had sunk into the fibers and refused to wash out. The imperial insignia on the chest was frayed at the edges, threads pulled loose like nerves exposed, then boots. The leather was cracked and softened, molded to someone else's gait. When I pressed my thumb into the sole, it did not spring back the way new material does. It held the indentation, as if remembering weight. A flak vest followed. It was dented in 2 places where shrapnel had struck, the dents hammered flat but still visible, like healed fractures that never set right. Inside, the padding was compressed and damp. I ran my fingers along the inner lining and felt grit embedded there, tiny fragments of earth and metal, relics of someone else's last weeks, a helmet. The inside band was stained dark with sweat. The edge bore a thin, jagged scratch that might have been a near miss, or a direct hit that failed to penetrate, and finally, a lasgun. The weapon was cold when I took it, but not clean. Oil streaked the casing, a faint smear of brown, black clung near the trigger guard, dried and sticky. The grip had been worn smooth, shaped to a hand that was not mine. I held it and felt, irrationally, as though I had intruded on something intimate. A man's hands had lived here. A man's breath had fogged the sight in winter air. A man had squeezed this trigger and died before he could squeeze it enough times. The quartermaster watched me inspect the gear with impatience. "You'll want to make yourself comfortable," he said, voice flat. "Try not to lose anything. We do not have surplus for sentimental mishandling." "This designation," I said, tapping my papers where the code was printed. "It doesn't match my—" The quartermaster's hand moved faster than I expected. A hard, open slap cracked across my cheek. The sound echoed in the depot, sharp and humiliating. My head snapped sideways. For a heartbeat, white sparks danced in my vision. The quartermaster leaned forward, his face inches from mine. I smelled his breath, stale recaf and something sour beneath. "Your papers match what the ledger says they match," he hissed. "Your designation is what the line needs it to be. Continuity requires it. Do you want to be corrected further?" My mouth opened and closed without sound. My cheek burned. I shook my head once slowly. "Good," he said, already turning away. "Efficiency requires continuity, not accuracy." Next, I stumbled back from the counter, clutching the issued life against my chest. The uniform bundle felt heavy in my arms, not because of weight alone, but because it carried a presence I could not name. It was like holding a dead man's skin. A replacement clerk guided me toward a changing area separated by hanging tarps. The tarps were stained with grease and mud, and as I pushed through them the smell intensified. Men stripped and redressed in silence, bodies thin and bruised, ribs visible beneath scarred skin. Some had fresh bandages. Some had old ones never replaced. No one spoke. Speech was a luxury, and we had learned to hoard luxuries. I found an empty patch of floor and began to change. The uniform did not fit. The trousers were slightly too long, the knees already broken in. The shirt clung strangely across my shoulders, stretched by a frame broader than mine. When I buttoned it, the fabric pulled at the seams as if resisting. The collar rubbed my neck raw almost immediately, stiff with dried sweat. Pulling the boots on felt like forcing my feet into another man's footprints. The leather pinched at the toes and gaped at the heel. I tied them anyway, not sloppy, because my fingers were still trembling from the slap. When I strapped on the flak vest, it settled against my chest with an unpleasant familiarity, as if it had been there before. The dents in the plating lined up near my ribs in a way that made me wonder, absurdly, whether the previous man had been hit in exactly those spots. The helmet sat too low on my brow. I tightened the strap until it cut into my chin. I looked down at myself and felt a sudden wave of nausea. I was wearing a dead man's life like an ill-fitting coat, and the smell of him clung to me. No matter how I adjusted straps or tightened buckles, I could not make the gear feel like mine. It was as if the items remembered their owner and resented my intrusion. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a message. This is not yours. This never was. A scribe came through the changing area, calling out designations, checking that each replacement had been properly outfitted. When he reached me, he glanced at my papers, and then at the code stenciled onto the flak vest's inside strap. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if noticing the mismatch that had earned me the slap. Then he looked up, expression blank, and stamped my papers again. "Designation confirmed," he said. "Do not answer to your old name. It will confuse the line." The line. Always the line. Not the squad, not the comrades, not even the Imperium as a grand, sacred concept. The line, an abstract thing that needed bodies to remain continuous, like a machine needs fuel. I asked, carefully, who had this before me? The scribe's eyes flicked to my face, then away. He lowered his voice, not out of kindness but out of habit. "That information is not required for your function," he said. "If you must know, he is no longer present. Do not attempt to retrieve personal effects. Those are considered salvage and are assigned separately. Your role begins now." He moved on, leaving the question hanging like a loose thread I was not allowed to pull. Later, when I was herded with other replacements toward transport, I noticed something I hadn't at first. The lasgun's stock bore a shallow notch, then another marks carved with a blade. Tallies perhaps, or attempts at control. Beside them, half scratched into the casing, were letters nearly worn away by handling. Not my name. Not even the designation they had given me. Just the beginning of a word, incomplete, like the man had been interrupted mid-identity. I traced the letters with my thumb and felt, for a moment, the weight of another's fear. It was absurd. These were objects, metal and cloth. But the Imperium teaches you to treat symbols seriously. Equipment is sacred. Weapons are prayers with triggers. And this gear, issued to me with such indifferent efficiency, felt like a relic of a life erased not by enemy fire alone, but by paperwork. As we climbed into the transport, the engine's growl vibrating through the floor plates, I looked at the other replacements. We all wore uniforms that didn't fit quite right. We all carried lasguns that had been held by someone else. Our eyes met briefly, then slid away, each of us privately acknowledging the same truth. We were not here to begin. We were here to continue. And continuation, I realized, is just another form of captivity, one that smells like old sweat and dried blood, and fits like a dead man's coat. They did not call it training. Training implied improvement, growth, the possibility of survival through knowledge. What we received was referred to as orientation, a word that suggested we were simply being pointed in the correct direction before being pushed forward. Orientation took place in a long, low chamber that had once been a records vault, its walls lined with empty data, racks and scorched parchment cabinets. The air was dry and bitter, heavy with dust, and the faint tang of chemical preservatives used to keep paper from rotting too quickly. We sat on backless benches arranged in tight rows. There were no instructors in the traditional sense. Instead, a single overseer stood at the front beside a lectern scarred with knife marks and wax burns. He wore a coat with the insignia scraped off, leaving pale outlines where authority had once been proudly displayed. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if he were reciting shipping schedules rather than preparing us for slaughter. "Everything you need to know," he said, tapping the lectern, as already recorded. "Your task is not to learn how to survive. Your task is to learn how not to repeat errors." A servitor shuffled forward and began distributing thin packets of parchment. When one landed in my hands, I felt its weight immediately, not physical weight, but density. The pages were thick, stiff with age and repeated handling. Ink had soaked deep into the fibers, and the corners were darkened with grime. Each packet was bound with twine, tied and retied so many times it had begun to fray. After action reports, I opened mine carefully. The first page was a standardized form, filled with neat columns and headings: unit designation, engagement duration, ammunition expenditure, casualty figures, outcome assessment. Where names should have been, thick black bars had been drawn with deliberate force, ink pressed so hard it had torn the parchment beneath. In some places the redaction bled through to the next page like a bruise. I read slowly, my lips moving silently. Failure to maintain cover discipline resulted in unacceptable exposure. Replacement arrived within acceptable time frame. Operational continuity restored. No description of the man who failed. No mention of how he died. Just the error, the correction, and the reassurance that the system had healed itself. We were instructed to read every report in our packets, to memorize the errors, to internalize the consequences. The overseer paced slowly behind us as we read, his boots scraping against stone, the sound setting my nerves on edge. "These are not cautionary tales," he said. "They are procedural documentation. Emotional interpretation is unnecessary." Page after page told the same story in different configurations. A position held too long, a position abandoned too early, ammunition miscounted, fire timed incorrectly, hesitation during advance. Each failure ended the same way: designation terminated, followed by replacement issued. The language never changed, only the circumstances did. Some reports included crude maps, drawn in ink and charcoal. Trench lines marked with straight lines overlaid on older, darker markings. I noticed how often fresh ink corrected previous routes. Arrows diverted around craters that had not existed before, positions shifted meters at a time. Beneath the new lines, faint stains remained, like ghosts of decisions that had gotten someone killed. I traced one such stain with my finger and felt a chill. Someone had followed that route once. Someone had trusted it. The overseer stopped behind me. I felt his presence before I heard him speak. "Notice anything?" he asked. I hesitated. "The maps," I said carefully. "They've been updated." He nodded. "Because the ground remembers better than you ever will. The reports tell you where others failed. They do not tell you how to succeed. Success is temporary. Failure is educational. We were not taught tactics. We were taught avoidance. Do not stand here. Do not advance at this angle. Do not assume the enemy will behave rationally. Do not trust cover that looks intact." Every instruction was framed negatively, as if survival were something that happened only in the gaps between mistakes. During a break, if sitting silently while your mind frayed could be called a break, I noticed something else. The redactions were not consistent. Some names were obliterated completely. Others had been scratched out hastily, the letters beneath still faintly visible if you tilted the page toward the light. I caught fragments, initials, half-syllables. Once, a full letter survived, lonely and accusatory. I wondered, irrationally, whether I was reading about the man whose gear I wore. That night, they tested us, not with drills, but with recitation. We stood in lines and were asked to describe specific failures from memory. Not what happened. What went wrong? Why was this position lost? Incorrect fire interval. And the result? Designation terminated. Replacement issued. The words came easier the more we repeated them. They slid into place in the mind, smooth and cold. I began to understand the true purpose of the exercise. Not to prepare us for combat, but to prepare us for inevitability. To make death feel procedural, expected, acceptable. When someone hesitated, when their voice faltered or their memory slipped, the overseer corrected them sharply. "Uncertainty leads to deviation," he said. "Deviation leads to reports like these." He would tap the packet meaningfully, as if it were a prophecy rather than a record. By the third session, something inside me had shifted. I no longer read the reports as warnings. I read them as templates. Each one felt like a future I was being gently steered toward, step by step. The idea unsettled me, but it also brought a strange clarity. If the path was already written, then fear was wasted energy. At the end of orientation, the overseer collected the packets. I hesitated before handing mine over, reluctant to let it go. "Do not keep records," he said, noticing. "Records create attachment. Attachment creates questions." I nodded and surrendered the packet. As we were dismissed, a final instruction was delivered through the vox, echoing in the chamber like a sermon. Replacements are not expected to alter outcomes. They are expected to preserve continuity. Remember this. I did remember it. As I lay on my assigned cot that night, the borrowed uniform itching against my skin, the words from the reports replayed in my mind. Redacted names, corrected routes, clean conclusions. I began to sense, with a creeping dread, that replacements were never meant to ask why the line kept breaking. We were meant to ensure that no one noticed it had broken at all. The transport dropped us at the front without ceremony, its rear ramp slamming down into mud churned so thoroughly it no longer resembled earth. The smell hit first, cordite rot, and the sour tang of chemical residue that burned the nose and lingered in the throat. The sky above was a low, bruised gray, layered with smoke that drifted in slow, exhausted sheets. Somewhere ahead, artillery spoke in steady intervals, not loud enough to shock anymore, just constant enough to remind you that the world was still breaking on schedule. An officer met us at the ramp, slate in hand, eyes flicking between faces and documents. He did not introduce himself. Names were irrelevant at this stage. He checked designations, nodded once at each of us, and gestured toward the trench line. "Positions already assigned," he said. "You will occupy them immediately. Do not alter layout. Continuity is priority. Continuity. Always continuity." The trench swallowed us quickly. Its walls were reinforced with corrugated plating and rotting timber, but the floor was pure mud, thick, sucking, alive with the sound of boots being pulled free inch by inch. I followed the others forward, my borrowed gear creaking softly, my lasgun held tight against my chest. The trench twisted and narrowed, its angles familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. I had seen these turns before, in the reports, on the maps layered with corrections. When we reached the firing position, I stopped without meaning to. It was already shaped for me. The sandbags were stacked to chest height, one sagging inward where something heavy had struck it. A shallow depression had been worn into the mud at the base of the parapet, just wide enough for boots to settle comfortably. The firing step bore scuff marks from repeated use, grooves worn by pacing feet. Even the ammo crate beside the position was angled slightly, lid cracked open just enough for quick access. It was not abandoned. It was waiting. The men already holding the line glanced at me briefly, then looked away. One of them nodded in my direction and said, "You're late," using a name that was not mine. I did not correct him. The reports had warned against that. Identity caused confusion. Confusion caused deviation. I stepped into the position and felt a strange, sickening sense of alignment, as if my body had slotted into a mold. My boots fit the depression in the mud too well. The lasgun rested naturally on the parapet, its weight familiar in a way that had nothing to do with training. My hands moved without conscious thought, checking charge level, adjusting grip. Muscle memory that did not belong to me stirred and settled. I was standing where another man had stood. I slept where he had died. That first rest cycle. I lay down against the trench wall, my helmet pressed into the same indentation someone else's head had made. The earth there was packed hard, darker in color, faintly stained. I did not ask what had happened. The answer was everywhere, in the dented sandbags, in the chipped plating, in the faint metallic smell that clung to the air no matter how often the wind shifted. Orders came, and I followed them. Fire intervals, target arcs, ammo checks. Everything felt rehearsed, not because I had practiced it, but because the position itself demanded it. When I hesitated, unsure whether to adjust my stance, the voice of the overseer from orientation echoed in my head. Deviation leads to reports like these. I stayed still. Stillness was safer. The men beside me continued to call me by the wrong name. It slipped into conversation casually, without malice. "You're on watch. Your turn to log. You see that flare?" Each time, I felt a small jolt, like something tightening around my chest. Correcting them felt dangerous. As if acknowledging the error might draw attention from whatever had removed the previous occupant. At night, or what passed for night beneath smoke and muzzle flash, I listened to the sounds of the line. The crack of distant rifles, the thud of artillery impacts further out, the wet, close explosions that meant someone, somewhere, had misjudged timing. In the lulls I heard breathing that was not mine, a steady rhythm that seemed to come from the trench wall itself. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself many things. Sleep was shallow and fragmented. Each time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of standing in the same position, doing the same motions, over and over, while someone watched from just behind my shoulder. I never turned around in the dream. Turning around felt like trespassing. One evening, during a brief quiet, I noticed something scratched into the inside of the parapet, half hidden by mud. I scraped at it with my glove until the letters emerged. They were crude, uneven, cut deep with a blade pressed too hard. Hold until replaced, not relieved, not rescued. Replaced. The words sat there, patient and accusatory. I stared at them for a long time, my mouth dry, my heart beating too fast. This was not a prayer. It was an instruction, or a promise. From that moment on, every order felt like a repetition rather than a command. Fire when told, duck when told, advance when told, retreat when told. As if I were acting out a script written for someone else, hitting marks already measured. I began to sense that the position itself had expectations, that it required a certain rhythm of movement and obedience to remain intact. When shells fell close, I reacted before thinking, dropping exactly where the ground dipped, raising my helmet just enough to see over the parapet at the right moment. The men beside me noticed and nodded approvingly. "He learns fast," one said again using the wrong name. I felt no pride, only a tightening certainty that speed came from familiarity, not skill. I was not improving. I was inheriting. The thought followed me through the days that blurred together. Each dawn brought fresh smoke and the same routine. Each night ended with my body sinking into the earth, shaped by another man's exhaustion. The position did not change. The enemy did not change. Only the faces did. And slowly, inexorably, I began to fear that I was not here to fight at all. I was here to complete something. To finish a pattern started before I arrived and destined to continue after I was gone. To stand, to endure. To fail in precisely the way required to justify another notice pinned to a board far behind the line. When the Vox crackled one evening with an alert tone, an adjustment notice, calm and precise, I felt no surprise, just recognition. The same recognition I had felt when I first saw my name on that board. Someone, somewhere, had decided the pattern needed to move forward, and I was standing exactly where it would end. Casualties were announced the same way everything else was announced, calmly, clearly, and without emphasis. The Vox crackled to life at the start of what passed for a morning cycle, its tone identical to that used for ammunition counts and ration notices. "Strength adjustment recorded," the voice said. "Designation losses updated. Replacement intake pending." There was no pause after the statement, no silence to acknowledge what it meant. The line did not stop moving because numbers had changed. Numbers existed to justify movement. I stood at my position and listened, my hands resting on the parapet worn smooth by use. Somewhere along the trench, a man muttered a prayer. Somewhere else, someone laughed briefly and then stopped, as if surprised by the sound. I looked down at my hands and noticed how thin they had become, the veins standing out sharply beneath skin permanently stained with grime. I could not remember when that had happened. Only that it had. Replacements arrived in waves now, smaller each time. They came in the back of armored carriers or on foot, guided by scribes who treated them like misplaced crates. Each group looked worse than the last. Thinner, quieter, eyes sunken deep into faces already stripped of softness. Some still carried the shock of transition, glancing around as if expecting explanation. That look never lasted long. The line cured it quickly. I watched them pass through the trench, each guided to a position already shaped for them. Some stumbled when their boots sank into familiar depressions they had never made. Others froze briefly when they realized how well everything fit. I recognized that moment. I saw it in their faces. The understanding that they were not arriving to reinforce strength, but to preserve appearance. We were told to hold, not to advance, not to achieve, to hold long enough for the numbers to stabilize. Stabilization window is critical, an officer explained one evening, gesturing vaguely toward the front with his slate. High command requires confirmation that attrition has leveled. Your role is to maintain presence. Presence. Another word that sounded benign until you lived inside it. Holding meant staying in place even when cover degraded. It meant returning fire on schedule, even when the enemy had shifted tactics. It meant not abandoning a position, even when doing so would save lives. Because abandoning it would create a gap in the line, and gaps complicated reports. Men died holding positions that no longer mattered tactically. They died because their deaths were easier to explain than movement. A stationary loss could be logged cleanly. A retreat required justification. The first time I watched a designation pass on, it happened quickly. A man 2 positions down took a direct hit during a brief exchange of fire. There was no drama, no scream, just a sudden absence where he had been standing, followed by a spray of mud and fragments. We froze for a heartbeat, weapons raised, waiting for orders. The orders came almost immediately. Designation vacant, the Vox said. Replacement reassigned. Within minutes, a new body was guided forward, papers checked, gear issued, and placed into the same position. The mud was still wet. The air still smelled of burnt flesh. The sandbags still leaned inward at the same angle. The name was spoken once incorrectly and then forgotten. The line had been corrected. I began to see the pattern everywhere. Death did not disrupt operations. It lubricated them. Each loss justified the movement of resources, the issuance of orders, the continuation of process. We were not bleeding out. We were circulating. The worst part was how quickly we adapted. After a time, when someone went down, my first thought was not grief or fear, but logistics. How long before the replacement arrived? Would the position remain uncovered long enough to draw enemy fire? Would we be ordered to compensate until continuity was restored? These thoughts arrived unbidden, automatic, and I hated myself for how natural they felt. The Vox reinforced it constantly. Adjustments announced with gentle precision, manpower variance within acceptable limits, replacement delay anticipated but non-critical, operational presence maintained. Each phrase pressed the idea deeper into my skull. As long as the numbers worked, everything was fine. I was ordered to assist with logging again, my handwriting now steadier, my movements more economical. I recorded losses without emotion, the stylus moving smoothly across the slate. I noted times and locations. I corrected small errors when they appeared. I was praised once for clarity. The praise felt worse than punishment. One evening, during a lull, a new replacement stood beside me and whispered, "How long do we have to hold?" I did not know how to answer. The truth that holding had no endpoint felt too cruel to voice. Instead, I said what the line had taught me to say. "Until ordered otherwise." He nodded, accepting that as if it were wisdom. Later that same night he was gone. I did not watch him die. I only noticed the space he left behind, the way the trench seemed to inhale slightly, preparing to receive another body. When the replacement arrived the next morning, I helped adjust his gear, tightening straps, pointing out where the ground dipped. I heard myself giving instructions with the same detached tone the quartermaster had used on me. "You'll want to stand here," I said. "It's safer." Safer. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth. I realized then that replacements did not exist to change outcomes. They existed to make outcomes presentable, to smooth the jagged edges of loss into neat columns and acceptable ratios. Flesh was the medium through which errors were corrected, fed into the machine until it ran within tolerance again. And I was no longer merely subject to the process. I was participating in it. That knowledge settled heavily in my chest, a weight that did not go away. I still flinched when shells landed close. I still felt fear. But beneath it all was a growing numbness, a readiness to accept whatever role was required of me next, as long as the line continued to look intact from a distance. As I stood in my borrowed position, holding ground that meant nothing except on paper, I began to understand that being a replacement was not a temporary status. It was a function. And once you were part of that function, the only question that mattered was how long it would take before your own designation was passed on, cleanly and efficiently, to the next body waiting to fill the gap. The first time I heard him, I thought it was fatigue finally winning. It was during one of the lulls, those dangerous stretches when the guns fell quiet just long enough for the mind to wander into places it should not. The trench was still, save for the distant rumble of artillery working another sector and the soft, wet sounds of men shifting in the mud. Smoke hung low, unmoving, like the air itself had decided to stop trying. I stood at my position, hands resting on the parapet, eyes scanning a horizon that offered nothing but churned earth and broken silhouettes. Then I heard a voice that was not part of the trench. Not there. It was quiet, calm, spoken with the familiarity of someone correcting a routine mistake. I stiffened, my grip tightening on my lasgun. I did not turn my head. Turning felt wrong, like acknowledging something that might take offense if recognized. I waited, counting my breaths, listening for confirmation that it had been nothing more than a thought escaping my skull, too exposed. The voice continued, "Closer now. You'll draw fire if you lean like that." My heart began to pound slow and heavy, each beat echoing in my ears. The voice was not panicked. It was not mocking. It carried no threat. It sounded tired, regretful, as if it had already seen the outcome of the mistake it was warning me against my better judgment. I shifted my stance, lowering my profile slightly, aligning my body with the shallow dip in the parapet, the same dip I had been told was safer. A second later, a round snapped overhead, cracking against a sandbag where my head had been. No one else reacted. The trench absorbed the sound and moved on. I stood there, frozen, my mouth dry, my skin prickling beneath the borrowed uniform. The voice did not speak again. But it did not feel gone either. It felt patient. I did not report the incident. There was no category for it. Auditory guidance from unknown source would not have been stamped and filed. It would have been flagged, and flags drew attention. Attention led to reassignment, and reassignment led to places where men disappeared without even being replaced. I told myself it had been instinct. Pattern recognition. The result of studying too many redacted reports and living too long in one position. The mind adapts, I reasoned. It creates shortcuts. That explanation held until the next time. A day later, during a brief exchange of fire, I was about to move forward to adjust a firing angle when the voice returned, sharper this time. Don't step there. The ground's weak. I stopped mid-motion. My boot hovered inches above the mud. A second later, a man behind me stepped into that same spot. The ground collapsed inward with a wet sucking sound, dropping him into a shallow sinkhole filled with water and debris. He struggled, flailing awkwardly, and in that moment of exposure, enemy fire found him. The sinkhole filled with blood and mud almost instantly. The voice exhaled softly, a sound like someone closing their eyes. That's how it happened to me, it said. I nearly vomited. After that, there was no pretending it was coincidence. The voice knew the ground. It knew the timing of incoming fire, the angles of shrapnel, the places where cover only looked intact. It spoke rarely, never raising its volume, never repeating itself unless I ignored it. It did not give commands. It offered warnings, corrections, the same kind I had been trained to absorb during orientation. I began to listen. At night, when the line quieted just enough for thoughts to become dangerous, I found more evidence that unsettled me far more than the voice itself. Scratched into trench walls, half hidden beneath layers of mud and grime were notes, short phrases, directions, observations, low after rain, fire comes from left after third volley. Don't trust the plating by the ammo crate. The handwriting was crude but deliberate, carved deep with a blade pressed hard. I did not recognize the hand, but I recognized the content. These were the same instincts I had begun to rely on, the same warnings the voice gave me. They were not new, they were old. I traced one of the carvings with my glove and felt a chill spread through my arm. Someone had been here long enough to learn these things, long enough to carve them into the walls as reminders, long enough to believe they might still matter. I slept less after that. When I did sleep, it was shallow and dangerous. Dreams came thick and heavy, not abstract nightmares but memories that were not mine. I dreamed of standing in this same position weeks earlier, wearing the same gear, hearing the same guns. I dreamed of making a single mistake, leaning too far, stepping wrong, and of the sudden, overwhelming certainty that this was how it ended. I woke from those dreams knowing details I should not have known. Where a shell would land. Which sandbag would split under pressure. Which man beside me would hesitate at the wrong moment. The voice was quieter during the day, almost respectful of the noise and chaos. At night it grew more conversational. I tried to warn them, it said once, during a long lull. But they don't listen to replacements. Only veterans. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw like I had been screaming without sound. Who are you? I whispered, keeping my voice low, my face angled toward the trench wall so no one would see my lips move. There was a long pause. Longer than any I had experienced before. For a moment, I feared I had crossed a line. Then, I was you, the voice said. Just earlier. The words settled into me like a final report. I understood then, with a clarity that hurt, that the man I was replacing had not simply died. Not entirely. Something of him had been left behind, not a soul in any sacred sense, but an accumulation of memory, fear, and unfinished function. The trench had absorbed him the way it absorbed everything else: blood, sweat, whispered prayers, last thoughts pressed into mud and wood, and now that accumulation had found a new vessel. Me, sleep became negotiation. I avoided it when I could, afraid of what else might surface if I let my guard down. When exhaustion won, and it always did, I braced myself for the dreams, for the sense of slipping sideways into another man's experiences. I woke sometimes with my hands moving on their own, reaching for places on the parapet that no longer existed. I began to fear not death, but continuity. That the line would continue through me the same way it had continued through him. That when I failed, and I would fail, the same warnings would linger, waiting for the next replacement to arrive and listen. The voice never begged, never asked me to change anything. It simply corrected, advised, endured. That was the worst part. It sounded like someone who had already accepted the system. Someone who had realized too late that replacements were not meant to escape the pattern, only to carry it forward with fewer mistakes. Until even those corrections were no longer enough. As the guns thundered and the trench shook around me, I felt the weight of that inheritance settle fully onto my shoulders. I was not replacing him anymore. I was continuing him. The officer did not look at me when he said it. He stood just outside the trench line, boots planted on a strip of duckboard that had somehow survived months of shelling, slate cradled in one arm like a devotional text. His coat was cleaner than most, its edges reinforced, its buttons polished to a dull shine. Men like him rarely stayed in one place long enough for the mud to claim them. He glanced down at his slate, then spoke in a tone that carried neither approval nor threat. Performance within acceptable parameters. Combat effective status confirmed. That was all. No commendation, no reassurance, just confirmation that I had not yet failed badly enough to require correction. The words settled over me like a sentence. Combat effective until failure. The phrase was not spoken, but it was implied in every syllable. Effectiveness was not measured by victory, or survival, or even obedience. It was measured by delay, how long I could postpone becoming a problem that required replacement. From that moment on, the orders changed. They did not become louder or more aggressive. They became tighter, timings shortened, margins narrowed. I was assigned tasks that required precision under conditions where precision was nearly impossible. Reconnaissance of ground already shelled into slurry. Courier runs across exposed sections of trench during active fire intervals. Temporary holds at positions that maps labeled as or unstable but necessary. Necessary for what was never explained. The voice, the one that had been the man before me, grew quieter during these operations. Not absent, just restrained, as if it understood that this phase belonged to me alone. When it did speak, it did so sparingly. This is where I started running out of time, it said once, almost gently. I was sent where survival margins were smallest, because replacements were plentiful. That truth revealed itself not through cruelty, but through efficiency. When manpower is abundant, risk becomes acceptable. When risk is acceptable, it becomes policy. I crossed open ground, under covering fire that lagged just enough to remind me it was never meant to protect fully. I held firing points with compromised cover, because relocating would have required updating too many reports. I was ordered to advance a few meters at a time, then stop, then advance again, each movement logged, each pause calculated. The line crept forward not like an army, but like a bureaucratic process inching toward closure. Each time I returned alive, I felt something strange and unwelcome disappointment. Not my own, the system's. Survival delayed resolution. It postponed the moment when a clean correction could be made. I saw it in the way officers looked at me, no irritation, no approval, just mild surprise that I was still present. Like a form that refused to be finalized, the men beside me changed more rapidly now. Faces rotated through positions faster than I could learn their features. I stopped trying. Learning names created attachment. Attachment created hesitation. Hesitation created errors. Errors created reports. Reports created replacements. I had become very good at not creating reports. The voice returned more often during these days, no longer warning, but reflecting. They gave me this task too, it said once, as I crouched behind a section of plating that vibrated with near misses. I thought it meant they trusted me. I did not respond. I knew better now. Orders arrived that made less and less tactical sense. Hold here, advance there, withdraw slightly, advance again. Each movement shaved away men, small losses deemed acceptable. The line looked intact on maps. That was all that mattered. One night, after a particularly narrow escape, I was summoned to a command dugout. The officer from before stood there again, slate in hand. He did not offer me a seat. "You are adapting well," he said. "Your response times have improved. Your casualty avoidance exceeds projections." For a heartbeat, I thought he might praise me. The thought felt absurd even as it formed. "Accordingly," he continued, "you will be reassigned to high attrition tasks until performance normalizes." Normalizes. I nodded, because nodding was expected. Inside, something finally gave way, not a dramatic break, not madness or panic, but a quiet understanding. This was the final stage. This was where replacements went when they proved too competent to waste quickly, but not valuable enough to preserve. I was being spent deliberately now. The voice said nothing as I left the dugout. It did not need to. The next operation was the worst yet. A push through a corridor of broken fortifications under overlapping fire arcs. Timing windows measured in heartbeats. No cover that could be trusted twice. I moved when told, stopped when told, fired when told. Men fell around me in pieces, their deaths sharp and immediate, leaving no room for reaction. I stepped over bodies without looking down, my mind focused entirely on sequence and survival. At one point, pinned behind a low wall that was already crumbling, I felt a calm settle over me that bordered on serenity. The fear was still there, but it had been compressed into something manageable, something efficient. I understood the pattern completely now. I knew where this led. I knew what failure would look like, and I knew it would be recorded cleanly. When I returned, alone from a group that had advanced together, the officer noted my arrival without comment. A scribe updated a slate. Another replacement was already being prepared somewhere behind the line, his papers stamped, his gear selected. My continued existence had triggered nothing but minor scheduling adjustments. That night the voice spoke one last time. "You lasted longer than I did," it said. There was no bitterness in it, only fact. That's all the system ever wanted. I closed my eyes briefly, leaning my helmet against the trench wall. For the first time since the notice board, I felt something like grief, not for myself, but for the endless chain of men who had stood here believing endurance meant something more than delay. I opened my eyes again and waited for the next order. It would come. It always did. I met my replacement before I knew that was what he was. He stood at the edge of the trench during a lull that felt too deliberate to be natural, his boots sinking slightly into the same mud that had shaped itself to mine. He was younger than I expected, narrow shoulders, eyes still too quick, scanning everything as if answers might be hiding in the smoke. His uniform hung awkwardly on him, the sleeves a fraction too long, the flak vest riding high on his chest. It was the same pattern I wore, the same wear marks, the same smell of old sweat and iron. He held his papers too tightly, knuckles white, as if afraid they might be taken from him, and with them the fragile explanation for why he was here. A scribe accompanied him, slate in hand, already halfway through transcribing his existence. The scribe's lips moved silently as he compared codes, stamps, and unit references. When he reached my position, he stopped. He looked at me then. Really looked. His eyes flicked from my face to my designation tag, then back to his slate. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. "Adjustment required," the scribe said softly. The words landed with a finality I felt in my bones. I was ordered to step back. No reason given, no accusation implied, just a gesture and a quiet expectation of obedience. I complied automatically, my body moving before my thoughts caught up. The young man was guided forward, his boots finding the depression in the mud with the same unsettling ease mine once had. The lasgun he was handed bore the familiar notches on the stock. I saw his thumb pause over them, just as mine had. He looked at me once, confusion flickering across his face. "Sir," he began. The officer overseeing the transfer cut him off without looking up. "Do not address outgoing personnel," he said. "Continuity is maintained." Outgoing. The word echoed in my head as if spoken inside a vault. My papers were taken from me with careful efficiency. The designation code that had defined my existence for weeks was struck through with a single, practiced line. A new stamp came down beside it, the ink still wet and gleaming RCWACLED. I watched the mark spread slightly into the parchment fibers. "Irreversible. You are reassigned," the officer said. "Await transport. Do not interfere." I wanted to tell the young man something. Anything to warn him about the weak ground near the parapet, about the way the guns timed their fire, about the voice that would come sooner or later if he listened long enough. But the words would not form. Even if I spoke them, they would be dismissed. Replacements were not trusted with prophecy, only with correction. As I stepped away from the line, the voice that had followed me for so long stirred faintly, like an echo losing its source. "So this is where it ends," it said, not accusing, not afraid. Yes, I thought back, though my lips did not move. There was no pain in the separation, just a hollowing sensation, as if something essential had been gently but firmly removed. The trench behind me seemed to exhale, settling around its new occupant. The pattern continued. They led me along a rear trench toward a staging area I had never been meant to see. The noise of the guns faded slightly, replaced by the hum of machinery and distant orders shouted without urgency. Clerks moved through the area in tight formations, stacks of parchment cradled like infants. Servitors dragged crates marked with fresh designation codes. The war did not slow down here. It simply processed. At the edge of the staging area stood another notice board. It was smaller than the first, less crowded, but unmistakable. Fresh parchment weighted at the top, pinned neatly, space left below for future corrections. I saw my name there, not yet written but implied. A gap shaped exactly like me. A clerk approached with a quill and paused, glancing at his slate. "Not yet," he murmured to himself. Pending confirmation of death, I realized. My absence from the line was not enough. The system required certainty. I was seated on a crate to wait, hands resting uselessly in my lap. Without a weapon, without a position, I felt strangely lighter and infinitely more exposed. The borrowed uniform itched against my skin, suddenly alien. I noticed how badly it fit now that I was no longer performing the function it had been shaped for. Time stretched thin. Minutes or hours passed. I could not tell. Eventually, another scribe approached, this one older, his movements slower but no less precise. He carried my papers, now heavily annotated. "Final update," he said. "Your designation has been successfully reissued. Replacement operational. Continuity confirmed." He did not look at me when he said it. I nodded once. There was nothing else to do. As they escorted me toward transport, a smaller unmarked carrier used for redistribution, I glanced back toward the line. I could not see the young man anymore, only the familiar silhouette of the position, alive with muzzle flash and movement. Somewhere there, he was learning the ground. Somewhere, he was beginning to inherit warnings that were never written down. The voice was gone now. Not silenced, completed. Inside the carrier, the doors sealed with a heavy clang. The engine rumbled to life, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. I closed my eyes and let the motion rock me gently, like a cradle made of steel and indifference. I understand now why replacements exist, not to win wars, not to save worlds, but to preserve the illusion that the line never breaks, that every loss is temporary, that the Imperium's vast machinery runs smoothly because it is fed constantly with compliant flesh. I was never meant to endure. Endurance was a side effect, not a goal. I was meant to fill a gap, hold long enough, and then step aside quietly so the process could continue uninterrupted. This confession will not change anything. It will not slow the guns or thin the ledgers, but it is the only thing I have left that has not been stamped, corrected, or reissued. My name will appear on a notice board soon, if it hasn't already. It will be read once, mispronounced, and forgotten. Another body will take the gear, the position, the warnings I left behind without knowing it. The system will not fail. It never does.